Gorbachev has visited Armenia, where the first official estimate puts the death toll at 45,000. Armenians in Britain say they're overwhelmed by the response here to the appeal for aid. And 2 years after the riot at Wapping, at least a dozen police officers could face charges. And that's all from Newsview this week. Good night. Good night.
Now look at the weather. Tomorrow rain will quickly clear Scotland as it moves south into the rest of Northern Ireland and Northern England. The southern half of England and Wales will be mainly dry and bright. It will be mild again, but much cooler and fresher over Scotland, where it will be rather windy at times. Tonight, BBC Two celebrates the 80th birthday of the French composer Olivier Messiaen, with a portrait of the man who is drawn on his Christian faith and his love of nature for inspiration.
In the world of nature, it is the song of the birds which gives the composer his greatest happiness. He has written, "In my times of gloom, what is left to me but to search for the true, the lost face of music, somewhere out in the forest among the birds."
Then, at 8:55, BBC Two joins Radio 3 in stereo and goes live to the Royal Festival Hall for the final act of Messiaen's opera St. Francis of Assisi. This is BBC Two. Today sees the launch of the United Nations Campaign for Human Rights and the end of our series Prisoners of Conscience. This evening, with the help of sometimes graphic news footage and testimony, Jonathan Dimbleby investigates what is being done to prevent torture, murder and disappearance.
40 years ago today, on the 10th of December 1948, the United Nations signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a day of hope and oratory.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
40 years on, we ask, how far have we traveled towards that dream? To a dream where our human rights are universally respected.
At one polling station, 12 people were killed by death squads using automatic weapons. Journalists trying to cover the vote were also injured. In Port-au-Prince, the capital, Haitians were left with ballot papers, but no ballot. There was no vote, only a débâcle.
It's not a message that's getting through. Take this incident in Jerusalem. The 15-year-old youth had been using a slingshot, but he'd been under arrest for several minutes and was no threat to anyone when the border police indulged in a totally gratuitous act of thuggery.
They beat bystanders as they headed onto the campus, drawing taunts from groups of students. The police then fired birdshot.
Those reports are but 3 taken from recent months, and they are exceptional. Not so much because they're stark evidence of the violation of human rights, but because those countries were caught in the act. There are 30 articles in the Declaration of Human Rights calling on all governments to respect what are referred to as the inherent rights of the individual. The purpose of our gathering here tonight is to find out 2 things. How widespread are the violations of this solemn declaration, and what is being done to stop them? To help us, Jan Martensen, Director General of the UN Office in Geneva, Lord Avebury, Chairman of the Parliamentary Human Rights Group, and Rosalind Higgins, Professor of International Law at the London School of Economics, and with them, an audience which has very particular expertise, as it contains those who have experienced torture and the extremes of injustice at first hand. When we speak of the abuse of human rights, what are we talking about? Here in Britain, for instance, there is fierce debate about whether the new Official Secrets Bill or the Prevention of Terrorism Act constitute an erosion of human rights. Indeed, the Prime Minister explicitly defended the contentious ban on broadcast interviews with Sinn Féin by insisting, and I quote her, that to beat off your enemy in a war, you have to suspend some of your civil liberties for a time. Important matters, those, but not our subject tonight. We're going to deal with torture, with imprisonment for speaking your mind, with the knock on the door at the dead of night, the arrival of the death squad. These are the ultimate violations of that set of human rights which you might think all nations would revere, which are at the very core of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. First of all, then, how widespread is the abuse? According to Amnesty International, 1/3 of all nations torture their own citizens. In these dark states, the suffering is frequently inflicted on the entirely innocent, as well as those who are guilty of some crime or another. In Somalia, a woman who was 2 months pregnant is picked up by the army, which is after her husband.
They wanted me to tell lies about my husband. I refused. Then the torture started. They put me in a sack and held me underwater. They would put out their cigarette butts on me and spit and urinate on me. Me, a pregnant woman. In the agony, I began to laugh frenziedly. Blood oozed out of my nose and mouth. I feel I died when I was there.
In Chile, a most persistent offender, a woman is set upon by soldiers on her way back from a demonstration.
The soldiers picked up a can of petrol from the truck and poured it over me. I stood weeping and spitting out the petrol that was in my mouth, and then a soldier threw an incendiary device at me. I went up in flames. I became a human torch. I tried to put out the flames with my hands, but it was impossible. All the other soldiers pointed at me and laughed. Then I fell to the ground unconscious.
There are many countries that have acquired a reputation for atrocity, but many more which are less familiar, though no less guilty. Some of them are our allies. In Turkey, a man is interrogated because he supports an opposition party which is legal, but inconvenient.
I was given electric shocks. I was beaten up day and night. And I was especially beaten up with iron bars. And they didn't let me sleep. They didn't give me any food for days. They opened the prisoner's eyes and they started to torture prisoner's family. They took off his wife's clothes. They attacked the sexual attacks started in front of him.
If you also consider those countries which hold prisoners of conscience, be they political opponents or others imprisoned merely for their beliefs, then 1/2 of those nations which belong to the UN are in violation of the solemn declaration that is made in their name. Not perhaps a very impressive record after 40 years in which the world is supposed to have been seeking to outlaw such crimes. And as well, many people and many organizations have been campaigning in a wide variety of ways to that same end. There's the International Red Cross and a whole host of charities, of which the most famous and influential is Amnesty International.
For the benefit of newcomers to the group, our adopted prisoner of conscience, Alal Al-Hazar, and here's a photograph of him that was taken in about 1977.
This is an amnesty group in Brighton, one of 3,800 such groups in all parts of the world. Nothing very special about them, except that they care, they give time and effort.
In Morocco.
This group contains a housewife, 2 teachers, a retired accountant, a shop assistant, and a student. They campaign with letters, not just to the prisoner of conscience whom they've adopted, but to anyone who may have the power to raise the case again, or even to set the victim free.
We don't get any reply from anyone, as far as I know. I don't know if Mr. Harrison has had much joy from writing.
I once got a reply from the Moroccan ambassador about a year ago when the King's state visit was on. And since then I've had no reply. I've had no reply from the King and no reply from the Minister of Justice. Once a reply from the Moroccan ambassador, and that was all.
Unlikely though it may seem, polite letters that receive no reply can have an effect. Maël Ben Ammar was imprisoned in Morocco for distributing leaflets calling for a change in government policy. In prison, he was tortured with electric shocks and beaten with iron bars. It was an amnesty group like that in Brighton which set him free.
Amnesty International allocated my case, first of all, to an adoption group in Sweden, in Stockholm. So members of this group wrote to me for many years. They tried in every possible way to make life more bearable in prison. And actually they quite succeeded in that. It gave me quite a lot of courage. And it made a difference having a large number of people who are concerned about my case. People who never met me before. People who live at the other end of the world, in Sweden. So it did help me to survive the awful prison conditions. I think there is nothing worse for a prisoner of conscience than being forgotten. So in this way, the group members, they publicized my case, and there were this permanent reminder for the authorities that there are people who are concerned about my situation. And this really embarrassed the government. And I was actually released before the expiry of my sentence. My sentence was 12 years, and I was released after 8 years.
At Amnesty's headquarters in London, they can show that Jamael's case is not exceptional. In the last 27 years, they've worked on behalf of 30,000 prisoners of conscience.
Right, I'll put you through.
Amnesty now has 700,000 members in 150 countries. It has a team of 250 researchers who collect and check the evidence. Amnesty's annual report is widely respected as an annual Bible on the violation of human rights around the world. Amnesty is in no doubt as to why its methods work.
Saying to the government it's not secret anymore, that there are people throughout the world who know what you're doing and who care about what you're doing. So unlike in the 1930s, no government now can be safe in the belief that they can abuse human rights and there'll be no reaction. And secondly, it's the pressure of so many letters from throughout the world. If I can tell you about a prisoner in the Dominican Republic, he said that he was sitting in his cell and the first 200 letters arrived and the guards gave him back his clothes. The next couple of hundred, the prison director came to see him. The next pile of letters, the prison director contacted the president. And when there were 3,000 letters written on his behalf, the president released him. And he got to see the president, who said to him, "How can someone like you have so many friends throughout the world?"
Effective, and you may think impressive. But even such commitment can't begin to defeat so virulent a cancer. That task rests with governments, and more especially with the international organization established in their name and charged to do their bidding. I refer to the United Nations.
The Palais des Nations in Geneva was built for the League of Nations over 50 years ago. It now houses the United Nations Center for Human Rights. The Human Rights Committee meets 3 times a year in front of an audience of independent experts and observers.
Para este efecto, vamos a proceder de la siguiente manera. Pero antes de hacerlo,
the 18 members of the committee, lawyers, professors, judges and the like, act independently of their own governments. They hear evidence, they seek to establish whether allegations before them are true or false, but they do not make judgments. Moreover, their resources are limited.
I think the major problem the committee is now facing is to be able to consider all the reports and all the communications that are coming. I think that probably the support of the Secretariat must be greater. I don't want to say that we have no support by the Secretariat. We have an excellent Secretariat with excellent support. But simply because of the financial crisis of the United Nations, it might be difficult to add new elements.
tener
This committee is only one of a plethora set up by the UN over the last 40 years to investigate the abuse of human rights. There are fact-finding missions led by experts called rapporteurs. There are working groups on arbitrary execution, slavery, and disappearances. There are committees or subcommissions on torture, on economic, social, and cultural rights, on the elimination of racial discrimination, and many more. They share one guiding principle. They never accuse, they never confront, there is no question of sanctions. Their task is to help, not judge. The Human Rights Centre takes but a tiny part of the Palais des Nations, and an even tinier part of the overall UN budget, 0.7% to be exact. Jakob Moller is in charge of the communications department at the centre. He receives thousands upon thousands of letters, which the Human Rights Committee has to consider. His department has to read the submissions and then write to each government concerned, asking for its response. This exercise is crucial. Without it, the centre can't function. Yet Moller's entire staff consists of 13 people, including, that is, the secretaries who write the letters. Mr. Moller is a diplomat, but even a diplomat is prone to despair.
I do not wish to use strong words, but it is very much inadequate. We could probably occupy another 10, 15, 20 people on a full-time basis. This is maybe something that I should not dwell upon. The organization, as everybody knows, is going through a financial crisis. There has been a recruitment freeze for a number of years. This has affected all parts of the Secretariat. Unfortunately, the Center for Human Rights also, and the communication section. I don't think that the human rights program, seen with the eyes of governments, is necessarily a very popular program within the UN system. I think that the fact that that less than 1% of the budget of the UN is allocated to the human rights program, to the Center for Human Rights, tells a certain story.
Lack of funds, lack of will. Not perhaps an unfamiliar tale, but 40 years on, disquieting evidence about the commitment of nations to the Universal Declaration which bears their signatures. But within those limitations, what notice do individual countries take of what the various committees say about them? Take disappearances, an eerily innocuous term to describe a form of final solution. This report is from the UN's Working Group on Disappearances, which asks governments to tell them what's happened to citizens who have apparently disappeared or been dealt with by the death squads. Clear-up rate for their investigations? 7, maybe 8%. The rest, 90%, remain unsolved mysteries. And consider, too, the report of the Special Rapporteur on Summary or Arbitrary Execution. In 1987, he contacted 27 governments to inquire into such allegations. 7 of them replied. The rest ignored him. And thus, at the bottom of so many pages in his report, you find the bland but chilling phrase, "At the time of the preparation of this report, no reply has been received from the government concerned." All of which leads to the next question. What more could and should be done?
When governments such as Romania, for example, continue to ignore the criticism of Amnesty and of the UN, I think one ultimate weapon which we should consider is the suspension of their vote at the United Nations, certainly on human rights matters, until they agree to cooperate with the UN machinery for rectification. There are many degrees of sanction which the UN can apply. All these countries depend upon the UN financial machinery, if not assistance. And if they refuse to cooperate with the UN on human rights matters, people might well say, we'll suspend talks on other forms of aid and assistance until you see sense.
In the United States, the former American ambassador to the United Nations is now the mayor of Atlanta.
The United Nations has been very reluctant to enforce sanctions against nations for human rights violations. We still have a sense in which we consider that the internal affairs of a nation. But I think we're moving toward a time when, for instance, we should realize that when there are human rights violations, it won't be long before there are going to be some kind of violations of territory and borders. That the relationship between Adolf Hitler and his treatment of the Jews and the invasion of the rest of Europe should be a lesson that we've learned.
According to Andrew Young, it is no accident that the UN is ineffective.
Consistently, the United States and the Soviet Union, since Dag Hammarskjöld, have conspired together to keep weak leadership in key positions in the UN Secretariat. The UN, if the UN doesn't work, it's because the founding members don't want it to work.
That's about as harsh a comment as you might expect to hear from a former ambassador to the United Nations about that organization. Mr. Martinson, fair comment?
Well, it's his comment. I wouldn't really say it's fair, because speak about weak leadership of United Nations in the face of Mr. Javier Pérez de Cuellar, when UN has received the Nobel Peace Prize, etc. Maybe put it in the perspective of Mr. Young's comments, which is more than 10 years since he was the ambassador.
Specifically in the human rights territory?
Well, I would say that when we speak about human rights, we live in a terrifying situation of having crimes against the human rights committing every minute when we are sitting here all over the world. On the other hand, we should not lose the perspective of the Human Rights Universal Declaration. 40 years ago, it was considered a very utopian, idealistic, unrealistic, perhaps well-meaning document. Today, 40 years later, this declaration has branched out in some 60 instruments protecting people in various stratas of life. We have a system of implementation, of control. We can send special rapporteurs to countries like Afghanistan, Chile, and so on and so forth. We have special rapporteurs on phenomena such as torture, summer executions, working group on disappearances. But, there's a big but, the effectivity of it is regulated not by UN, not by any secretariat, but the member countries. They have to show the necessary political will. If they don't do that, we are lost.
Professor Higgins, you are a member of the Human Rights Committee at the UN. You heard the complaints from within the organisation serving that committee about resources, about the fact that it wasn't a popular cause. Do you feel that working in there as well?
Yes, I think every member of the committee feels that, particularly as it's one of the committees that is held in high repute in the United Nations, and so we can read in the records one day how well we're doing, and here the states ask us to increase our efforts, but at the same time know that the resources are so limited that we have great difficulty in getting through the workload that we have.
Are there people who you would be taking up, cases you would be exploring, of the kind of terrible torture that we heard about in the film, that are not being picked up at the moment simply because you don't have the resources to do it?
No, but we're not dealing with them as fast as we should be dealing with them. And we've also had, over the last 2 years, a 400% increase in our caseload. And yet we are required to deal with that increased percentage with exactly the same resources. So the problem is going to become critical in the very near future.
Now, you are also, if I'm right, only dealing with a certain proportion of the membership of the UN, those who signed the relevant covenant on political civil rights, which is, what, 87, around 80, 90 members?
That's right. We deal with those in terms of state reports and our own investigation. The cases, the numbers are even fewer. That requires a separate acceptance, and the number is still the modest side of 50.
So this backlog that you're talking about and this huge upsurge relates only to a very small proportion of the total cases that there are in the world.
To about 50 countries in the world, and a surprising group. They are not all the liberal democracies who you might expect to expose themselves to us. It's a wide range of countries.
Let's then go to the audience for the first time to find out those who have experienced torture at first hand, how they regard the role, the behaviour, the resources of the UN. Mario, you are Colombian. That's right. Your brother was Colombian.
That's correct.
He was executed, assassinated in 1986.
That's right.
Do you know why?
My brother was collecting information on human rights violations in Colombia, and the idea was to bring it to outside Colombia, to Geneva, to Amnesty International, to groups working on human rights violations, assassinations, disappearances.
How was he assassinated? Do you know?
Well, he was kidnapped while working in Cali, disappeared for overnight, and the day after his body was found on the outskirts of Cali, shot, and that's it.
You went on to the Human Rights Commission, which is the overall umbrella body. Now that was with your brother's case, what, plus other cases as well?
That's right. We took 921 disappearances that we compiled from Colombia, from human rights groups in Colombia. And we also took over 3,000 political assassinations that we had records of. And we found very difficult, because Colombia was the chair of the commission at that time. Mr. Hector Charri Samper was the chair of the commission, and no delegation wanted to hear anything from us.
Why not?
Well, I believe they were more interested on Cuba. There was a lot of pressure from the United States on the human rights violations in Cuba. I can appreciate that there are violations there or not, but our case is so difficult. We had 5 trade unionists killed every week.
But are you alleging that because the chairman of the commission was Colombian, therefore Colombian cases would not adequately be heard by the commission? Is that your charge?
I believe it's more than that. There was a sort of complot from people, from the different delegations, not to be interested, but in those particular issues or countries where particular countries had some interest.
But can I come back to Professor Higgins on this? And I know that on your committee you act as independent individuals, but on the commission, the members of that commission are political appointees. Can you see, as a lawyer yourself, that there is something rather odd, not necessarily perverse, but odd, that the chairman of the commission investigating potentially this kind of outrage should be the person of which one of his citizens is trying to address this cause?
It does, on the face of it, strike me as curious, and normally in those circumstances there are deputy chairmen to hand over to. For example, when we recently did a state examination of Ecuador, our president, whom you recently saw on the program here, Prado Vallejo, stepped down. But nonetheless, I do think it can't be denied that the Commission is an extremely political body, and that there are certain flavour of the month countries who receive much more attention in terms of their human rights violations than others at any given moment of time.
Flavour of the month countries?
Yes,
Mr. Martinson?
There is an interesting corrective to this, because in the Commission, the non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, for instance, has a right to participate and submit documents. And if countries, for whatever reason, are not very active on a case, there's always NGOs that could at least bring it up and have it discussed. So I think that's a very good corrective in this case.
Satisfied, Mario?
Well, not entirely. We had just a minimum amount of time. We had, I think it was 6 minutes, which was given to us by an NGO, because we had no chance, but an NGO gave us that time, while the countries have an open time limit.
There are some nodding heads here, and I want to go down to you, Mr. Whitaker, who represents the anti-slavery pressure lobby. You go before the UN. What do you go for?
To highlight abuses of human rights, particularly slavery. But I'd like to make one fundamental point. The biggest abusers of human rights are national governments, and national governments sit in judgment on themselves at the United Nations. I think we must also take up a point that was made there that NGOs have only 10 minutes in which to state a case.
NGOs are the voluntary organisations, the
like
charities
ourselves,
like
yes,
ourselves.
non-governmental organisations. They have 10 minutes in which to state their case. They cannot come back to it. They have no right to reply to the government. Once they've said it, then that's it for the next year.
Within the limitations of the range of powers that the nations give themselves, how effective do you find your activities there?
There's no easy answer to that, but what I would like to say is that we were the first organisation, one of the first organisations, to use what is known as the 1503 resolution. We're never going to use it again. At least it's highly unlikely we'll ever use it again.
What's, in simple terms, what's the 1503 resolution?
It is governments meeting in camera, in secret. The theory is that governments will get together, they will say, don't be a naughty boy to an offending government. That government will therefore have its face saved, therefore everything will be all right. In practice, this doesn't happen. And because it's secret, one never knows the outcome of the initial input, except that the corridors of the UN do leak a bit, and we know that on the only occasion we used this resolution, it was passed up the ladder to ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, who simply shelved it. We think that abusing governments can benefit, just like Dracula can, from publicity, from light, from illumination.
Mr. Martinson, secret meetings between governments who are sitting in judgment on each other. Charge, however well-meaning you may be and your operation may be, bound to be ineffectual.
Well, it's the member countries that charity begins at home, you know, as was so wisely said. What we try to do now, because we are reorientating our program to put much more emphasis on public awareness, on information. And today, we are launching a worldwide information campaign in order to try to create an awareness all over the world, create public opinion, and to bear pressure on governments, because we can't get at governments politically, because they are our masters. But through a well-informed public opinion all over the world, we can push for the implementation of human rights.
Now, you touched earlier on the question of the special rapporteurs of investigators of a mission going into a country, so long as the country lets you in to investigate allegations. Yusuf Hassan, you're a journalist.
Yes.
You work in Africa.
Yes, I cover African countries.
You cover African countries. You've accompanied, you've seen these missions in action, investigating allegations of abuses of human rights.
Yes.
How's it been?
Well, in most cases, in fact, in most of the countries that I have actually seen missions going, or UN agencies looking into the problems of refugees, they come through the governments. And in most situations, the victims who have actually suffered in those governments sometimes don't even know whether these are friends of the government or they are friends who've come to hear what their problems are. Secondly...
Why do you say that?
Because they are supported by the administration, they are supported by security with their cars and paraphernalia. It is a huge entourage wherever they go to. And this presents a case whereby they have to be protected, they have to be provided by that particular government. And in these situations, the victim is not free to express him or herself. And particularly, we're talking of a victim who does not perhaps communicate in the language of the UN officials. And here you have a case whereby you would leave those victims there tomorrow, the UN would go away, or whatever international body that is actually investigating their problems, they would be left there to suffer. So many of these people actually wouldn't be coming forward to present their cases as freely.
Are you saying that the missions, these investigative missions, are ineffective, that there's no point in sending them? Are you going as far as that?
I think in most cases, unless they actually go beyond the present limitations they have, they are meaningless, because in the first case, you would have a problem whereby the victim has suffered already. He's a fragile victim. There's intimidation, there's fear, and the idea of even encouraging the person to come out and actually speak about problems that have happened 3-4 months ago by itself needs quite an encouragement. Now, if you have a case whereby the government is giving support to that UN body in going to these troubled areas, that government actually has an interest, first of all, to hide the facts. It has an interest so that it protects its name in front of the international community. So there are so many obstacles to be overcome before, in fact, the victim gets a fair hearing.
Professor Higgins, you, because you read endlessly about the horrors that are perpetrated around the world, must find that quite a persuasive point, that governments will hide one way or another what's going on in their country, even if a mission goes in. And moreover, once the mission is in, the people who live there have got to live with the government after the mission is gone.
I think these are very real problems that have been highlighted, but equally I think one has to appreciate that the people engaged in these missions are extremely experienced. They will usually lay down with the government conditions about the circumstances in which they are allowed to interview persons. The choice will be made by them so that the persons can't be penalized for having volunteered to come forward. And there are many damning UN reports that show that the governments have by no means been successful in hiding.
So you wouldn't go as far as Yusuf went and said it's a waste of time, that it's meaningless, that it's a kind of cover?
No, I think indeed a lot of the other UN bodies require this sort of information to be able to do their work in turn.
Yusuf?
I think it is, I'm quite sure that all missions and all fact-finding journeys to many of the troubled places of the world have some use. But on the whole, one cannot overlook the fact that there are very serious limitations. One point you mentioned is that actually governments are given certain rules to present people who should present the evidence. But that is not the case in some cases. Governments actually try to encourage even those people appearing in those places when the mission is in that country. Some of them are in fact deported or forced to flee those countries to another country. And then they can come back maybe, or they may not come back because of fear, even after the mission is gone.
I'm going to go to Hedayat here. You're from Iran.
Yes, I am.
You fled from Iran.
I did, yes.
You were in fear of your life?
Of course.
Now you're here, you are a lawyer and you represent a group of people who are also fearful of their lives.
They are, yes.
They fear execution by the regime.
They do.
On terms that would be outlawed by the United Nations Universal Declaration.
Absolutely. For example, you know, the UN ambassador of the regime some time ago, he was expressing that what the principles that we exercise are above the principles that are exercised in these organizations. Because our conception of the right to life is entirely different from the conception of the right to life as it comes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its covenant.
Would you, Mr. Martinson, not like to see the other UN members act on these matters, on these outrageous executions that we've heard about? Wouldn't it give more credibility to the UN?
Yes, indeed. And I would like, with disagreeing with our friend that spoke here before about the ineffectiveness of the Special Rapporteur's report, because, for instance, in the case of Iran, there has been a very strong report from the Special Rapporteur that has been debated now at the United Nations this fall, and with a lot of embarrassment for, really, the Iranian government. So there is this public debate and criticism.
Forgive me, the reporting, but Iran doesn't actually allow the Special Rapporteur this investigation into the country, does
but
it?
still, he has done a very good job, because he has been in touch with all kinds of groups outside.
Okay, we've covered quite a lot of territory, different aspects of the limits of UN power and authority. Lord Avebury, you watch this somewhat from outside as chairman of the parliamentary group here in Britain. Do you appreciate that these are the limits of real action in the real world for the UN?
I think there are practical limits, and you can see this in the process which operates in the United Nations. Whenever I've been there, I've been rarely taken aback by the extent of the cynicism of dealings between nations and the bargains that are struck for perfectly reasons of self-interest.
Are you therefore cynical about the ability of the UN to do what it seeks to do under the Universal Declaration?
Yes, I think there are severe limitations. That's one of them. The other one is, of course, that the states which violate human rights may be friendly with the big power blocs and therefore immune from criticism. Why does Ethiopia get away with it? Because she's a friend of the Soviet Union. Why do other countries get away with it? Because they're friends of the United States. And so Chile and South Africa, who've got no friends at all on either side of the power divide, are the only ones that attract universal criticism.
Mary Staunton, we saw you in the Amnesty film working for individuals in this very simple, basic way of writing letters. When you look at the huge machinery of the UN doing what it can, as Mr. Martinson and others have described, with the effect that has been discussed, do you come to the conclusion, which may be implicit in everything that we've said, but in the end it's down to the political will of individuals and individual nations if we're going to move forward to try and conquer some of what we've been hearing about?
Yes, clearly we can't rely upon governments. It is a question of stiffening the political will of governments, and that is the duty of each and every one of us. In the struggle for human rights, like any other struggle, it's a question of the balance of forces. The governments have the armies and the military. What we have is public opinion, and we know governments do react to the glare of public opinion.
Thank you. Public opinion, the UN only as strong as the will of its members. The question is therefore how strong is that will? More especially, how strong is the will of our government activated by our public opinion? And what is British policy?
At the Foreign Office, special responsibility for human rights falls on a parliamentary under-secretary, Tim Egger MP.
What did you think about how you should...
At this Amnesty International competition, Mr. Egger presented prizes to children for the best painting illustrating one article of the Universal Declaration. His account of British policy reflects the long-standing approach of the Foreign Office.
What we try to do is to ensure that other governments live up to the international obligations into which they've entered freely. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the best example of that obligation. And we try to ensure that in applying influence, pressure, either publicly or privately, on other governments, regardless of their political persuasion, regardless of where they are situated geographically in the world or their state of development, that they apply those criteria in the Universal Declaration rigidly to the treatment of their own citizens.
That, I suppose, is the classical statement you would expect from the government of many Western democracies. Sometimes you act behind the scenes, sometimes you go public, and never more so than in the case of Poland.
But as Solidarity's supporters tend to interpret it, Thatcherism means mostly an increase in the individual's rights as against the state. When she visited the grave of Father Popiełuszko, murdered by secret policemen 4 years ago, the crowd interpreted it as a powerful gesture of support for Solidarity.
Mrs. Thatcher's demonstration of solidarity with solidarity and her wreath-laying at the grave of Father Popiełuszko certainly underlines the impact of going public about human rights.
The incomparable skyline of Istanbul was a natural attraction for Mrs. Thatcher's second day here, but she likes to be seen to be doing business, and the strong British bid for another bridge linking the European and Asian shores across the Bosphorus got her strong support. Istanbul is also redolent with memories of Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War.
In Turkey, the Prime Minister laid a wreath at a less controversial grave. Nor did she raise in public the thousands of political prisoners which Amnesty International estimates are held in Turkish jails. Indeed, it's widely believed that she didn't raise the subject at all.
Nowadays in Kenya, in spite of the opulence of the suburbs and the definite air of political stability, people do disappear and are badly treated by their interrogators, and they don't always emerge from prison alive.
Still, when Mrs. Thatcher arrived here tonight, it certainly wasn't with any intention of souring the atmosphere by raising the question of President Moi's approach to his internal problems, unlike the United States, which has protested strongly. Her concern is to support her host's political position as a good friend and a good customer of Britain.
The contrast between the very public commitment to human rights in Poland and the very private commitment on her visits to Turkey and Kenya does raise the question, is Britain softer on our allies than on our adversaries?
I mean, there is no double standard. I mean, there's some sort of conspiracy theory, which you seem to be trying to put forward, that there is a double standard. I totally reject that assertion. We spend a great deal of time trying to ensure that we apply the same standards in different countries, in different parts of the world, with different kinds of regimes. I won't claim we get it absolutely, perfectly right every time, because we are human, we have to make judgment, it is a subjective area, but that we aspire and work very hard to have the same criteria across the board I state quite categorically.
And there's no question that the British government has indeed raised human rights, both with Kenya and Turkey, in the last year. But the question is, how are they raised and by whom? There's no more potent way of voicing our national concern than public condemnation by the Prime Minister on her own official visits. Number 10 told us that when the Prime Minister goes abroad, she raises human rights either publicly or privately when she deems it appropriate. However that policy is decided in any particular case, though, it is clearly not determined by the scale of abuse. It's notable, for instance, that according to the best estimates, Turkey has some 10,000 political prisoners, while Poland, according to Amnesty International, has 1. The experiment of going public on all occasions has been tried by the United States during the Carter years, when Andrew Young was determined, he says, to mete out equal treatment to friend and foe alike. But he failed.
Well, what we have learned, or should have learned, is that where we pressured people on human rights, as we did in Brazil and Argentina, those countries are doing well. Where we thought ourselves being protective of our friends in Iran or even in the Philippines, those countries are in some considerable turmoil. If we really are concerned about the well-being of a trading partner and a good business deal, we'll be honest with them on human rights issues as well. A friend of mine who'd been a missionary in the Middle East for years suggested to me when we first got to the White House that if we were serious about human rights, we would start in Iran. And he said, the Shah is going to be overthrown if you all don't support him with a constitutional monarchy. Something has to be done to empower the middle class. Otherwise, there's going to be a revolution. I said, well, the Communist Party is not that strong in Iran. He said, no, the revolution will be from the mosques. Well, I thought it was ridiculous. I talked to President Carter about it. He gave me a group of CIA reports, all of which said the Shah was very stable and secure and comfortable, and we forgot about it. That was our undoing. The reason why Jimmy Carter, amongst other, I would say the main reason why he was not re-elected president was because we didn't move on human rights in Iran.
The question is, what kind of pressures can be brought to bear on a country which does abuse human rights? There are a range of measures that might be taken. You've got, as we've already heard, private persuasion, even maybe private threats. Then there's public denunciation. Beyond those words, there's action, the best known of which is the ban on sporting links with South Africa. In the case of Russia, the Prime Minister has warned that Britain won't attend a human rights conference in Moscow until the Soviet record has improved. The Americans under Carter used an economic lever on Latin America, suspending aid to countries like El Salvador, Brazil, and Argentina. Then there's the possibility of all-out sanctions of the sort that have been debated in relation to South Africa. So there are a range of options, all of which depend on the judgment of individual governments.
I think government's effectiveness will very much depend upon an articulate, concerned public opinion, reminding them, for example, that in the 19th century, the dock workers of Liverpool told the government of that day that they were in favor of abolishing the slave trade, even though it threatened the jobs of themselves. And I believe there's much more support for effective action by human rights of ordinary men and women throughout the world.
We could say, for instance, from our experience, when we were fighting blacks against whites here in Georgia, this was a depressed, impoverished, racially embittered area. And only when the mayor decided that we were going to be a city too busy to hate, and we began to work together, only when the federal government from outside said to us, either you allow everybody to participate in the economy or there'll be no more federal government support. Sanctions. Sanctions enabled us to do what we knew we had to do anyway, but which we didn't have the moral and political authority to do alone. And so sanctions shouldn't be seen as a punishment. Sanctions should be seen as a help for people to be able to do what they know they need to do.
I don't think that sanctions in the terms of military or economic sanctions work or are normally appropriate. What we try to do, very often using the UN system, the Commission for Human Rights, making speeches there, making public or private representations to the foreign ministers or to governments or another way, is to point out to them where we think they're failing to live up to the standards which they themselves have signed up to. Sometimes we have to do that publicly. Sometimes we have to have a row about it. Sometimes we do it privately.
Lord Avebury, two broad issues there. One, the question of pressures, sanctions. The other of standards and whether there are double standards. You heard Timega there give a powerful account of the government's attitude. Do you accept his judgment that there aren't such things as double standards, there are just different ways of doing things?
Well, there are very different ways of doing things. I mean, the classical example on which we published a report last year was the case of Tibet, where our government has an interest in maintaining friendly relationships with the People's Republic of China, not only because it's a huge market, potential market of over 1,000 million people, but also because we need to conduct a transition of power in the case of Hong Kong, which necessitates continuing good dealings between us. And that means that we soft pedal on human rights, that when the monks were massacred in Lhasa, no mention was made of it. When the civilians are prevented from practicing their religion, nothing is said about it. Well, very little is said about it compared with what was said about the violations of religious freedom in the Soviet Union. So there is a major difference in treatment according to our perception of the benefits that we get from good relationships with those countries.
But that's different from saying double standards. That's saying that there are real political and other strategic interests which have to come into play.
That's correct.
You accept that as inevitable?
I think it's a fact of life. I mean, it's one that I wish didn't occur. I mean, I would like to have the same treatment of violations of human rights in China or Indonesia, which may be big potential trading partners, as in much smaller countries where we can criticize without any disadvantage to ourselves.
Now, you've been looking at these issues for a very long time. Is there any serious difference between the attitudes of successive British governments? There's nothing unique about what you detect in this government?
Frankly, no. I mean, I think if you look back many, many years and you say, what attitude did the Labour government take to the violations of human rights in Argentina in the 1970s? We were quite prepared to sell frigates to Argentina. I went to see the then Minister of State in the Foreign Office to argue that we shouldn't do this because of the atrocities that were being committed by the generals. And his answer was, well, by the time these frigates are delivered, there'll be another regime in power there.
Mr. Colvin, you sit on a Tory committee on foreign affairs. Those figures in the film, Poland on the one hand, one case, Turkey, something like 10,000 cases. Enormous publicity for Poland, virtually none for Turkey. Not double standards?
Different climates. The climate in Poland now is one of perestroika and glasnost. It's a reforming atmosphere. And as such, I think the Prime Minister was probably right to take a fairly high profile. Turkey is different again. I think subtle persuasion in the case of Turkey could work. The Turkish record on human rights is absolutely appalling. But Turkey now wants something. Turkey wants to become a member of the European community. Now, I think rather than imposing sanctions on any country, it's better to offer the carrot, the positive inducement. And Turkey knows, and this is why Turkey is now a democracy, why Turkey has signed the Convention on against torture, while Turkey now has a freer press, why Turkey now permits trades unions. These are all positive moves in the right direction. And incidentally, what is also interesting, you mentioned earlier, the problems that the United Nations has in coping with those who, disobey the rules under the Declaration. The problem with the United Nations, there are 159 countries there, but only 6 democracies, some of them not very satisfactory democracies. But you mentioned President Carter. I actually had lunch with President Carter 2 days ago, and he was convinced that the further the countries of the world and the members of the United Nations can advance towards proper parliamentary democracy, the better chance there is of getting an atmosphere in those countries that respect and follow a proper program
You said
of human rights.
6 countries that are democracies?
60.
60, I'm so sorry, I
60.
misheard you. I thought you were being very strict
60,
by your
it's still not
criteria,
enough.
much stricter than even I'd expected of you. I just want to go up here to you, Karim. We saw you at the beginning of this film, the beginning of the programme, with a terrible tale of what had happened to you and what was happening to other prisoners, including the sexual torture of their families.
Right.
You've heard the Prime Minister went to Turkey, and the question of human rights in Turkey has been raised in private. Do you accept that that, under the circumstances, is what Britain should do, and that's the real world?
Actually, first of all, I have to mention today that thousands of Kurdish and Turkish people are in prison, and many are held without trial and without being charged and tortured. That's a fact in Turkey today. More than 2,000 people recently started to hunger strike for their rights in Turkey. But on the other hand side, Turkey has signed United Nations Declaration of the Human Rights, and was the first country to ratify the European Conventions against the tortures. But there is evidence that Turkey still continue to violate this international agreement.
Now, what
I
do you
think the only reason they signed the European Conventions against torture to help their application to the EEC.
So you're saying, I mean, you're saying effectively that Mr. Colvin's being somewhat deceived here, that everything's going very badly. You're saying, he's saying, suggesting, well, because it's a democracy, things are now going an awful lot better. When you hear what Karim has just said, are you at ease with simply private words by the Prime Minister? No public statement of the kind that she gave in Poland?
Well, the art of persuasion is called diplomacy in this case. Diplomacy takes many different guises. Palmerston used to send gunboats. I think what the Prime Minister was doing in Turkey, and she wasn't the only person, Geoffrey Howe, officials, others are continually talking to Turkey about human rights issues.
Is Turkey an appropriate member of the EEC for so long as there are these human rights violations which have been addressed in these numbers of ways?
The answer to that is definitely no. And that is why Turkey, by becoming a democracy, by permitting criticism through the press and by people outside, by having a parliamentary system, is beginning to develop into the sort of country who we would welcome in the EEC. But at present, no.
What you are saying by implication is that at the moment there is a real distinction between the existence of the forms of a democracy and the reality of human rights. And until democracy also means human rights, that country should, by us, to that extent, be treated as not worthy of entry into a democratic community.
Proper observation of human rights is a component part of a proper democracy. That is true. Now, that doesn't mean to say that all democratic states are perfect. And I think even before Britain starts to lay down the law to other people, we have to be absolutely certain that our own house is 100% in order. And that is a point which you made very early in your film, and I think everybody should take on board.
Thank you. I want to go over here to you, Wanjiru. You come from Kenya. Your husband is in jail in Kenya. What for?
My husband was arrested in July of 1986, was held for 3 months in Comunicado, where we didn't know where he was being held, was brutally tortured, and then in October of the same year, he was declared detained without trial. He has been held since that time without any charge and without having been brought to trial.
Do you know why he has been subjected to this, why he offends the government?
I have not the slightest idea from official government sources why he's being held. He has tried to find out why he's being held. We can only guess that it is because of his democratic activities that he is being detained without trial.
What is your view of the approach that Britain has taken to what is a good friend, as a nation of Britain's, in respect of the human rights question in your country?
I want to say 2 things. First, that the government, what the British government has done, and in particular what Mrs. Thatcher has done, has not helped the human rights situation in Kenya. When she visited Kenya in January this year, she made a statement that President Moi's human rights record was a good one. At that very time, 2 people were being tortured and actually died of torture in police custody in Mombasa. The year before, about 10 of them had actually died. So for her to make that statement that President Moi's human rights record is good was for, especially for those of us who are experiencing the torture of having people detained without trial, was appalling.
Mr. Colvin, it's a pretty harrowing case, isn't it? Was the Prime Minister right to say what Wanjiru said she said when she arrived? Indeed, I think was reported as saying.
Yes, I think the facts of that case need looking into, but I do think there's one very important principle we must never overlook, and that is the danger of interfering with the internal workings of another country. I think that is important. I think in the case of Kenya, the decision was taken that this one was going to be played softly, diplomatically, and I think that is the way to take it forward.
But just to pursue this point a little bit, in Poland, the decision to go and support solidarity, was that not in that sense interfering in the affairs of the internal affairs of a country?
I think the climate was quite different, and you know that.
Very well. Lord Avebury, those two cases, Turkey, Kenya on the one hand and Poland on the other, you said at the beginning that all governments are inclined to be like this, and you accept it as an inevitable thing, and this is not double standards. What is your view of what ought to have been done there?
Well, I think one very important point was highlighted by that is that we have a perception of countries which hold some sort of elections as being relatively immune to criticism, because Kenya or Turkey or Guatemala or Sri Lanka or Guyana hold elections, that ipso facto they must be immune from criticism, whereas in fact some of the worst violators of human rights are ones that hold some sort of elections. I mean, they may not be very fair ones, but somehow this makes them immune from criticism in the West.
Do you, Mary Staunton, in Amnesty, have any sense that one of the Western democracies is better or worse than another, or are they all much the same to the extent that they balance off different aspirations, different needs?
Well, of course they do that, but what happens in other countries, Scandinavia, Netherlands, is that their parliaments have a regular scrutiny of how foreign policy is informed by human rights. And that's what we're lacking in the UK. Although there are groups like the Parliamentary Human Rights Group, there's no regular yearly debate in the House of Commons, there's no yearly review by one of the select committees to actually tackle this very issue. How is our foreign policy affected by human rights? Are we sure that we're not aiding human rights abuses?
Do you think, Lord Avebury, going on to this question of measures that could be taken, teeth that could be put into the attitudes of governments to get responses, but the range of measures, whether it is speaking publicly through to total sanctions, are things that ought to be available, ought to be more readily on the table, ought to be used more? Would that in fact have an effect, or is that a sort of bit of political naivety?
No, I think that is very important. I mean, I think it's very incongruous, for example, that we should be restoring diplomatic relations with Iran at a time when these atrocious mass murders are taking place there. I mean, it seems to me the reverse of a linkage between human rights and our performance in relation to links with those countries. And I wish that there were not only negative links in the sense that you might impose arms sanctions or downgrade your trade or cultural relationships with countries that violate human rights, but also, as has been said, we should have positive linkage of human rights, so that where there's an improvement by a particular country, then we can improve our aid or our trade or cultural relationships with them. I think positive linkage between those things and human rights is just as important as the negative.
What do you think about that, Mary Stanton? I'll come to you just a minute. Mary Stanton, what do you think of using sanctions, sort of graduated sanctions, against offenders, if governments do that? Would that help Amnesty's task?
In fact, it isn't Amnesty International's job to go for boycotts, to tell governments what to do.
No, I know that. Would it help your task?
It totally depends upon the situation and the government's relationship with that country. What would help our task is regular questioning and pushing of successive administrations by Parliament as to exactly what are you doing in this situation.
Yusuf, you actually are Kenyan, so you're familiar with the situation in Kenya.
Yes.
On the sort of range of things, what would you like to be seen done to Kenya, if anything, or are you happy with the way in which it's done at the moment?
No, I'm very unhappy. In fact, the British Prime Minister had a golden opportunity to be able to do something about human rights in Kenya, because Kenya is very much intertwined with this country. It receives the highest percentage of aid. Britain has a military base there. Britain even provides judges, which these judges actually sentence our people who do not have the right to legal representation, where political opposition of any kind is banned. And she went there and used the best adjectives that can be used positively under a government which has dictatorial powers over its people. In fact, she went there just some few weeks when they had declared that even the secret ballot is no longer going to be used in selecting leadership. In fact, even yesterday, a cabinet minister resigned from the government because he thought that elections were rigged. And when other cabinet ministers attacked him for that, he resigned in principle. So all the time, there has been a clampdown on all sorts of opposition. Democratic rights that actually could normally be expressed by people are banned in my country. And yet, Britain has so much influence there that it could use positively, and it does not do so.
Mr. Colvin, if you had the ear of the Prime Minister, and if you had heard, which you just have heard, what Yusuf was saying about Kenya, and what we heard before about Kenya, wouldn't it be in your mind to say, Prime Minister, you care about human rights, you've been seen to care about human rights, you ought to demonstrate it in the case of Kenya by putting the pressure on Kenya, not by just talking to the Prime Minister, the President in private, but saying, waving the big stick a bit.
I think she already has the message and has received the message that you put to me. But I do believe that in waving the big stick, you can very often hurt the people you're trying to help. That's the danger.
Yusuf, you hurt the people you're trying to help. It's the same argument that is heard elsewhere in the case of South Africa.
I find that quite outrageous, because it's always the case that people think that people in Kenya are not actually sitting down. They're fighting for their democratic rights. They're not begging to be liberated. They're not begging to be assisted by external forces. All they're asking the international community is not to help their government to use its superior apparatus to suppress them.
If you're going to have any form of sanction, as you know, it must be uniform and supervised and enforced. And quite frankly, I don't see any form of economic or other sanctions against Kenya working. So you're coming back to practicalities.
Lord Avery, I want to come back to you on the point of the Kenyan disagreement there, which could be multiplied by many countries.
Yes, yes, yes.
If we ended up exercising sanctions against one or other of those countries, wouldn't we have an appalling confusion in international relationships?
I think that Michael has a point when he says that individually Britain could do very little in the case of Kenya, that if we started to apply sanctions unilaterally, that it would have not the slightest influence on the human rights situation within that country, but if we could take action collectively with all our other partners, then it might indeed bring things to a head.
Mr. Martinson, we started with a look at how the UN operated. We've heard appalling stories in this studio tonight. We've had the debate about what could, what might be done. Individual measures by governments, maybe sanctions. It would be very easy to be pessimistic given the state of the abuse of human rights in the world. When we have the next anniversary, is whoever sitting in your shoes then going to be a pessimistic or optimistic man about how far we've traveled in the intervening years?
I think it's wrong to say that one had a pessimistic view of the present-day situation, given the perspective of what the situation was 40 years ago when we had nothing. Now we are taking within the Secretariat, where we are limited by the political will of the 159 member countries, a constructive, aggressive sort of approach in a triangular way, because we say legislation, that's more or less behind us. Now implementation is the important thing. And to implement, we can assist by, for instance, training people in the judiciary out there. So we are going out in the world, bringing human rights. Now we have had a course, for instance, in Guatemala, in Philippines and whatever, now in Moscow. And thirdly, the third pillar in our approach is the information, to create a global awareness of the rights, because I think that's, in the end, apart from sanctions and whatever, that's one of the few things with which we can influence governance of the world.
You are an optimist?
Yes, I am.
You optimist in the end, Professor Higgins?
At the end of the day, with all the horrors that are going on, I'm an optimist. I do think progress has been made. And I would simply like to say human rights are not an intervention in domestic jurisdiction. That is the fundamental underpinning of the Universal Declaration.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. That's all from this 40th anniversary programme. Whatever has been done, is being done, whatever could be done, whatever will be done, the fact today remains that 40 years on, half the countries in the world still violate the most basic principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Good night.
Many of you may well have been watching our Prisoners of Conscience series over the last fortnight, telling the moving stories of individual men and women imprisoned for their beliefs. On the evening of December the 29th at 9:50, BBC Two will be showing a short programme about the remarkable public response to that series and the surprise release of some of the prisoners of conscience whose cases were featured.
Name